Have you ever felt like God has completely and totally rejected you? Whereas Psalms 52 through 59 report a season in David's life in which his kingship was rather uncertain. Here in Psalm 60, we seem to read a psalm that extends out of a time of stability, a time when David was recognized and ruled as king, as reported in 2 Samuel chapter 8. And yet, this psalm shows a remarkable change of perspective of one who feels like God has rejected him. This prayer becomes his link to the confidence that God will yet grant him victory. And so, in the first stanza, we see that regardless of how God has really treated the writer feels like God has rejected him seriously. And so, this writer, whether originally David's voice or one who is expressing David's thoughts as if he is himself David, we do not really know for sure. We see that this person thinks or feels like at least at one point in his life, perhaps in the recent past, God rejected him. But yet we see in verse 4 that this writer comes back to the confidence that those who revere God, that is, fear him, God calls them to come together under his banner, the banner being a sign that points to his invitation that they would gather together and serve together, particularly in defense against those who oppose them. We see that in verses 5 through 8, this writer calls out confidently for God's deliverance in view of his certain victory. All of these different areas of land are portions that relate to the promised land that God promised Abraham all the way through the people of Israel that he would give them. And yet this land appears to be torn up and divided. But despite this division, this writer has the confidence that God himself will bring his people, wherever they are, scattered or not, back to this land in order to reign with him. The psalm writer speaks his renewed confidence here in verses 9 through 12. And even though he feels like he has been rejected, he knows God will yet grant him the ultimate victory. So you see, God in this writer's view is his go before in battle, in view of the guaranteed outcome, which is as certain as God's spoken word. The writer calls out to receive the victory that is his. It's a simple prayer of deliverance directed to God's promise, and it becomes this writer's link to a renewed perspective of his struggles. Though he feels rejected, or at least felt rejected at one point in the recent past, the speaker knows that he is not rejected, and he builds up his own confidence in God that God will win his war despite the intimidating circumstances that he faces. Did you notice that in this psalm, it is spoken corporately, and yet, if you look at verse 9, it turns to an individual statement by the one who represents his people. Whereas the entirety of the psalm, except for this verse, is spoken corporately. This is spoken from a single person, the king himself, or one who represents the king. Who will bring me to the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? Is it not God, you who now have rejected us and no longer go out with our armies? What a fantastic way to end this psalm. Give us aid against the enemy, for human help is worthless. With God, we will gain the victory, and he will trample down our enemies. You see, this psalm recognizes that the fate of the people of God is dependent upon the fate of the leader, the king himself. And so this psalm gives voice to the Messiah to come, the one who represents his people in the wars that they face, particularly because the world itself comes against them and does not want to recognize their king as their ruler. Give us aid against the enemy, we can hear Jesus say. For human help is worthless. And with Jesus' confidence as he lived and prayed and believed such thoughts, we also can have such confidence. It is in Jesus, our King, that we will gain the victory. That is, those of us who have put our faith in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sins and follow him as our Lord.